I want to start with a prayer. This is a prayer by Stanley Hauerwas. I don't know if any of you know that name. Stanley Hauerwas is famous or infamous as a Duke theologian and ethicist. What he's infamous for is occasionally his ethics classes need to be bleeped, which isn't something one's used to encountering at seminary, I think. But so it's not surprising his prayers are prayers plainly spoken. And this is a prayer that he wrote. He was asked to say a prayer. He doesn't like doing generic public prayers because he doesn't think that really feels like prayer to him, so he kind of bristles at the idea. He was asked to give a prayer for Reynolds Price. Does anybody know that name? He's a novelist and a poet and a short story writer from North Carolina who was also at Duke. So they go and they ask Hauerwas to do a prayer for it, and he says, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing a prayer. It's just I can't do anything. If I can't, I'm a Christian, so if I can't pray a Christian, I can't. Anyway. And then he thought about it, prayed about it, and he said, okay, I'll do it. But the prayer he wrote is called Addressing the God Who is Not the Ultimate Vagueness, which is, I'll tell you why I chose it in a minute. Let's pray. God, you alone know how we are to pray to you on occasions like this. We do not fear you, since we prefer to fear one another. Accordingly, our prayers are not to you, but to some ultimate vagueness. You, of course, have tried to scare the hell out of some of us through the creation of your people, Israel, and through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. But we are a subtle, crafty, and stiff-necked people who prefer to be damned into vagueness. So we thank you for giving us common gifts, such as food, friendship, and good works, that remind us our lives are gifts made possible by sacrifice. We are particularly grateful for your servant Reynolds Price, who graces our lives with your grace. Through such gifts, may our desire for status and the envy status breeds be transformed into service that glorifies you. Amen. There you go. That's Hauerwas on Reynolds Price. If you know Reynolds Price's story, he's also a North Carolinian. And in the mid-1980s, he began to have some difficulties and some sensations in his back. And he went and he found out that there was a tumor in his spine. When Reynolds Price went in for surgery, and one of the surgeries to remove the tumor, this is what happened. It was the big lake of Kinnereth, the Sea of Galilee in the north of Israel, the scene of Jesus' first teaching and healing. I'd paid the lake a second visit the previous October. Still sleeping around me on the misty ground were a number of men in tunics and cloaks of first-century Palestine. I soon understood, with no sense of surprise, that the men were Jesus' 12 disciples and that he was nearby, asleep among them. Then one of the sleeping men woke and stood. I saw it was Jesus, bound towards me. Again, I felt no shock or fear. All this was normal human event. It was utterly clear to my normal eyes and was happening as surely as any event of my previous life. Jesus bent and silently beckoned me to follow. Jesus silently took up handfuls of water and poured them over my head and back till water ran down my puckered scar. Then he spoke once. Your sins are forgiven. And turned to shore again, done with me. I came on behind him, thinking in standard greedy fashion, it's not my sins I'm worried about. So Jesus, receding back, I had the gall to say, am I also cured? He turned to face me, no sign of a smile, and finally said 2 words, that too. That's how Reynolds Price tells his story. He was cured of his cancer, but the surgery took away his ability to walk. And he spent the rest of his life paraplegic. Why would I tell you that story? Well, I think it'll become clear. My plan this morning, I really don't know what this is supposed to be, so we'll figure that out together. But I want to tell you a little bit of my story, and really these are more moments that might be relevant to where we are and who I am here with you, and what it might mean to us together being Calvary Church in downtown Memphis. So just a few events that kind of were seminal, like that event was seminal for Reynolds Price. The way I see the world may be the way I see what it means to be a church, what it means to be a priest. The other thing I'm going to do to you is I feel part of my mission is also to inflict poetry on people who would have tried to stay out of its way all their life. Because I believe with William Carlos Williams that it is difficult to get the news from poems, but people die miserably every day for lack of what's found there. So, there you are, truth in advertising. A lot of people in the life I came out of, which I grew up in more non-denominational evangelical circles, would ask if you've got a life verse, and I don't have one. Maybe that's why I became Episcopalian. But I do have a story, a biblical story that I return to a lot, and it'll be related to what I've already started talking about. It's from the Gospel of Luke. On the way to Jerusalem, Jesus was going through the region between Samaria and Galilee. As he entered a village, 10 lepers approached him, keeping their distance. They called out, saying, "Jesus, Master, have mercy on us." When he saw them, he said to them, "Go and show yourselves to the priests." And as they went, they were made clean. Then one of them, when he saw that he was healed, turned back, praising God with a loud voice. He prostrated himself at Jesus' feet and thanked him, and he was a Samaritan. Then Jesus asked, "Were not 10 made clean? But the other 9, where are they? Was none of them found to return and give praise to God except this foreigner?" Then he said to him, "Get up and go your way. Your faith has made you well." That's a familiar story from Scripture. Probably everybody's heard it. For a long time, I thought it was about being polite or fulfilling your obligation, saying thank you. Weren't you trained to say thank you? All those 9 people were rude to Jesus. They didn't say thank you. I don't think that's what it's about. I think it's about the fact that something wasn't alive in those 9 people, that gratitude wasn't alive in those 9 people, and it made Jesus sad. Gratitude, there's a Benedictine monk named David Stendhal Rost who's like 92 or 3, and he spent his whole life talking to people about gratitude. You don't need to read books, he has a TED Talk on it. Gratitude, this says David Stendhal Rost. He said, a lot of times we think that happy people are grateful. But he says, I don't think that's the way it is. If we cultivate gratitude in our lives, we'll be happy. If we show up on a particular Sunday or Tuesday or whenever, grateful for whatever reason, he thinks we can actually cultivate it and kindle it. If we end up grateful, it's not that we fulfilled this obligation and run back to Jesus and said, I've just remembered to say thank you. It's that there's actually some vibrant life alive in us that's important, that I think is essential to being Christian and alive in the world. And the other thing David Stendhal Rost says is gratitude is a great mystery, because we all know people who have every reason to be grateful if we look around them, every privilege, all the stuff, all the trappings that ought to make for, oh, I got all this stuff, and they're miserable. And we all know people, maybe like Reynolds Price, who lost their ability even to move themselves through the world, who are deeply grateful for the gift of the next day. There's not this neat calculus between if you have this many blessings, then it adds up to this gratefulness in our hearts, right? There's something else involved. There's some other way of being in the world or being in a relationship that ends up in gratefulness. And gratefulness, for me, honestly, it's hard to even define happiness or well-being as a different concept. If I show up today grateful for the gift of this day, this moment, I'm about as well as I can be in the world, even if I'm sad, even if I'm grieving. So I tend to return to that story a lot, kind of lay my story over and against it, ask myself, how does gratitude happen in my life? It's not because I go running off after great things. It's something else. It's some way of being in the world that I think Jesus was trying to show us. I'm going to tell you a few odd stories. The first one is about a trip to Comiskey Park. And I think it'll play out a little bit of this story for me. It's 1990, and for you diehard baseball trivia people, that was the last summer Comiskey Park was open. I just graduated from college. We really weren't Chicago White Sox fans, but my dad said, let's take a family trip, one last trip to Chicago before they bulldozed Comiskey Park. My brother came. I have one brother. And we all went up there. I don't remember anything at all about that game. I don't remember who they played. I don't remember who was pitching. I don't remember who won, whether Chicago won. I only remember one thing, and it's burned into my brain. At some point during the game, my mother had to use the restroom. What you don't know about my mother is that, like Reynolds Price, she couldn't walk for herself by that time. My mother had MS for 35 years. And while I was in college, she was confined to a wheelchair. So the image that's burned into my brain is my father at Comiskey Park. If you don't know this, an ancient baseball stadium is not the most ADA kind of accessible place in the world. The image is my father yelling out that he was coming into the women's restroom because there was nothing else he could do. He had to call out and take my mother in there to do what is absolutely most basic to every single human being. There are certain needs if there's another great equalizer, I don't know what it is. I was embarrassed. I was anxious. People were spilling out. Understandably, women were spilling out saying, what just happened? Some guy came into the... Burned into my brain. I have no idea what else happened. I think it's an important event for me as a person, as a Christian, for a number of reasons. One is I suddenly, even though I had this whole story of my mother's slow health decline, I had this whole story going on in my life that led to this moment, but that one, for some reason, drilled in what the world looks like from the perspective of somebody the world hasn't been arranged for. In college once, I had a guy come and talk about how oppressive the ADA was for churches because some people couldn't afford to make their churches accessible. I'm quite sure, anecdotally, that's true. I'm quite sure there's a congregation somewhere that was poor in some situation for which this was a problem. But I'd seen too many places, too many instances where the world has simply not taken this person into account. Did it ever occur to you that a 3-inch curb might as well be a 50-foot wall if you're trying to get over it on wheels? So I had a happy life. I'd had a happy life. The world really was kind of made for me and folks like me. It took that instance at Comiskey to really drive home, how do I actually start to turn around and look at the world from the perspective of other people for whom it hasn't been made. Jesus did it all the time. It was lepers. It was the people on the side of outside the town. It was Samaritans. That this guy was a Samaritan and a leper is just piling on why nobody should have anything to do with him. And Jesus is seeking him out. He just persistently finds this person who sees the world from the perspective of an outsider. So that rings. Now, the other problem with that is that, with this experience for me, is that it also kind of rearranged my view of prayer. Here's a poem. I'm going to do the World's Not Made for Me poem, then we'll do the prayer one later. This is Marie Howe. It's called The Star Market. The people Jesus loved were shopping at the Star Market yesterday. An old lead-colored man standing next to me at the checkout breathed so heavily I had to step back a few steps. Even after his bags were packed, he still stood, breathing hard and hawking into his hand. The feeble, the lame, I could hardly look at them. Shuffling through the aisles, they smelled of decay, as if the Star Market had declared a day off for the able-bodied, and I'd wandered in with the rest of them, sour milk, bad meat, looking for cereal and spring water. Jesus must have been a saint, I said to myself, looking for my lost car in the parking lot later, stumbling among the people who would have been lowered into rooms by ropes, who would have crept out of caves or crawled from the corners of public baths on their hands and knees, begging for mercy. If I only touched the hem of his garment, one woman thought, could I bear the look of his face when he wheels around? Seeing the world from the perspective that's strange to me. That was the first lesson. How do I get that perspective more often? The second problem with this whole situation is that it suggested to me that prayer doesn't work. Because there were a whole lot of people praying that this got reversed for a long, long time. And it didn't. So I guess prayer doesn't work in any really helpful way. And I'd grown up, we would pray, we would pray for a reliable used car, or to find my wallet where the concert tickets were lost, or so gradually, when the big ones, if God's really paying attention to my lost wallet and that kind of stuff, but kind of missed this detail over here, it starts to break down. What happened over time, though, was that pulled me further and further kind of back into, you know what, if God doesn't do things that make sense to me, God must really not do much of anything. I didn't realize it. I was still very churchy, still very much Christian, but I slowly kind of backed into this. God must not really just get involved, because if God does, God's just kind of capricious. So I got a poem about that too. This is by Scott Cairns. This is a guy who also grew up in the Midwest in evangelical circles and became Greek Orthodox. So he has an interesting perspective on things. This is called Possible Answers to Prayer. Your petitions, though they continue to bear just the one signature, have been duly recorded. Your anxieties, despite their constant, relatively narrow scope and inadvertent entertainment value, nonetheless serve to bring your person vividly to mind. Your repentance, all but obscured beneath the burgeoning yellow fog of frankly more conspicuous resentment, is sufficient. Your intermittent concern for the sick, the suffering, the needy poor is sometimes recognizable to me, if not to them. Your angers, your zeal, your lip-smackingly righteous indignation toward the many whose habits and sympathies offend you, these must burn away before you'll apprehend how near I am. With what fervor I adore precisely these, the several who rouse your passions. I think the poem's a pretty good picture of a shift that gradually took place in me about how prayer and the Christian life works. I had the petition filing kind of thing going. It's come inside me. I got to launch these requests out, and they're sorted. Who knows how and why, and sometimes it seems arbitrary. It took a long time to realize that I think our prayers, our habits of prayer, are actually meant to transform us, the way we are in the world, the way we see the world, our gratitude for the gift of the next moment, the next day. And what's really, really annoying about that poem is I think our prayers are supposed to transform us in a way that we apprehend the nearness of God and the way God adores the person who infuriates me, my enemy, the other pole of my political spectrum, wherever you are right now. We might as well name it. That possible apprehension that God utterly adores the person I despise is rough. So that was a shift that happened. I think it's all, I told you this would be a little bit I think I said it would be meandering. Maybe I didn't. It's going to be meandering. All of this is related for me. I think we learn what we learn of God, our experience of God. I don't think it didn't happen for me in a straight line. This is me plucking out some things. So, after that, prayer became something that wasn't so interior between me and God, but actually something more participatory. And I wondered if a lot of what changed for me had to do with what was going on in my mother's body. Maybe prayer is more bodily than just mental, filing mental requests. So then I did become an Episcopalian. Ardell and I did together. In in Advent of 1996, we wandered into Grace Episcopal Church in Siloam Springs, just thinking, let's do Advent, let's try this. I could use some structure to help me get to Christmas sane and Christian, maybe. And so we went for the weeks of Advent, and then we got to Christmas Eve service. I don't think we had been to a Christmas Eve service, but not in an Episcopal church, I guess. Christmas Eve wasn't a thing, wasn't a church thing in me growing up. And here's what happened. Grace Church was too small to have their own full-time priest. A woman named Edie Bird was there. Now, we were moving out of a tradition that did not embrace the full, all of the gifts of women in ministry. That was part of what we were pushing against. So, one, we had a woman. Second thing that was amazing was that she just had a baby. The priest was a woman who just had a baby on Christmas Eve. After the service, Grace Church was so small, there wasn't actually a room for Edie to go nurse her child that was private. So we're walking out of church, kind of thinking we'd like to be in a tradition where there's more place for women and the experiences of women. And there's the priest who's just preached and served his communion at the back of the church, nursing her child under her robes. I mean, talk about just being lifted up and dropped onto Mars. But again, it wasn't an idea. It wasn't some concept that women should have a full place within the church. It was this encounter, this bodily experience of a woman having the bodily experience of nursing her child. And it completely disrupted the way I saw the world. We got it pretty bad. I think we were confirmed by the next summer, right? Yeah. I don't remember anyway. We quickly got confirmed. We said this is different. And for me, it was the bodily part of liturgical worship that opened something else. God may be at work in ways I don't understand, because it's not just this request filing, I need this to happen, make that happen. It's people standing and singing and kneeling and all of the crazy calisthenics we do together as Episcopalians, that some formation is going on kind of deeper down. One more detail about my life up to that point is I'd gone off to college, well, I'd been in college before as a English major, so I got out and, of course, didn't have a job. I didn't let that happen with my son. He's a religious studies major, so he'll... instead of philosophy. Anyway, so I got out of college, and completely unbeknownst to me, I ended up spending 10 years as a carpenter. I did. I wandered around and ended up working with my hands up in Wyoming in the mountains, just because I wanted to be in the mountains of Wyoming for a winter, and went to Washington State, and I started to do this carpentry thing that was not on my radar at all, but again, was an embodied experience. I was kind of learning to encounter the world through my hands instead of just through my head. And I think I'm telling you all this because I think it took over and over and over again for me to be pulled out of my head and into the world outside my head. And so working as a carpenter ended up changing the way I saw the world. And I want to read you some little thing. I'm not going to talk the whole time, I promise. This is something I wrote, though, that I think has to do with liturgical worship and being a body in the world. I learned to install a door on an ordinary weekday in small-town Arkansas. The house was a nondescript tract home whose pinkish mottled brick was dated before the mason even finished his work. The door was an equally uninspiring metal unit from the lumberyard to be installed at the house's main entry. It had been delivered to the site already hinged and hung in its jamb. In a matter of a few minutes, my boss, Dave, had given me all the information I would ever need to install a door. He told me how to make sure the studs on the hinge side of the opening were plumb in two directions, tacking up shims to correct for the framer's hurry. He explained to me that a push on a corner in one direction would affect a logical movement in another one. All I had to do was fill the framed opening with the door, make everything plumb and flush. When Dave returned an hour and a half later, He was clearly but politely surprised that I was still struggling at my task. I had all the information I needed, but when put into practice, that seemingly rigid object behaved like a balloon in my inexperienced hands. A push to its here bulged its there wildly. A butterfly shim tap created a whirlwind of chaos in some faraway place on the door. Dave stepped in, gave the door a few knowing bumps and shoves, and in a matter of moments, all was right with the door. There are different kinds of knowing. And the goal of any apprenticeship is an accumulation of knowledge in the hands. No explanation is required other than the properly fit thing, the flush door, the mitered corner, things visibly meet and right. Many Christian traditions place a great deal of value on religious information. Accordingly, the Christian faith is measured in a quick tally of doctrinal positions. Real Christians are called believers, maybe a term that suggests the possession of some essential and accurate information about God. I grew up in one such tradition. Our information happened to come from the methods and sources embraced by the right end of the religious spectrum, but the left had and has their methods and sources as well. But even though I couldn't have said so at the time, a hunch was growing that my knowledge of the faith wasn't making its way into some terribly important parts of myself. I still felt like that clumsy apprentice with sufficient information in his head, but whose hands remained ignorant and inadequate. I'll leave it at that, on that one. I found that my way of being in the world, becoming Episcopalian, becoming a liturgical person, was once again so similar looking back to this experience of coming out of my head and working with my hands with stuff. I needed it. We don't all need the same thing, but somehow I needed these encounters with the real physical world. And my spirituality switched around 100 degrees. What happens is it ended up involving all of you, which is complicated. If it's just me and Jesus, it's tidier at least, right? But if it's y'all, it's y'all. Not only is it y'all, it's strangers. I mean, there's this essential place for strangers, these physical encounters with strangers and outcasts that Jesus keeps kind of arranging for. That guy on the side of the road, that guy from the wrong town, he keeps arranging his life so that these encounters happen, and he drags his friends through them. So those have become kind of seminal for me as a Christian. We're formed not just in our heads, but we're formed bodily through our encounters with other people, through friendships, through kneeling, through standing, through singing, through receiving the gifts, the tangible gifts of the sacraments. Over time, I've come to really believe that these are the essential experiences is what the church is about cultivating and make sure it happens. While we were at seminary in Virginia, we ended up at a church downtown D.C. called the Church of the Epiphany. And Church of the Epiphany is kind of an anomaly. The 8 o'clock service is huge and vibrant and lively. That's no shame to the 8 o'clock service, but that's not a typical description of an 8 o'clock service in an Episcopal church. And the 10:30 was actually smaller. The 8 o'clock service was a worship service with the downtown people who were poor downtown. And it was quite amazing. There was breakfast afterwards, and I was from Siloam Springs, Arkansas, where population 7,000, so this was a whole culture shift for me. But it was the first time that the gift of a city really began to register. I didn't know what to do at the city when we got there. We got lost. We couldn't drive, all of that stuff. But the gift of the city was this presentation of people who were strange, people whose experience of the world couldn't be more different from mine. I mean, what did the world look like for Roosevelt, who sang in the choir but suffered from schizophrenia? I mean, one day I was cleaning the tables with Roosevelt, and I had the mistake of trying to get into a theological discussion with him. We were talking about the Trinity, and I said, Roosevelt, none of us can understand the Trinity. We all fall into heresy. And he kind of snapped up and said, I understand it. And he told me about it. The gift of the city, I think, is a particular gift. Church can be church anywhere, but I came to believe that actually the context into which we're called matters, and the church could probably have some things to say about its physical context, about the way its neighborhood works or doesn't work. How does it include strangers? Is our neighborhood constructed in a way to keep me from ever encountering someone who isn't like me? Or is it conspicuously constructed to make space for people I haven't met to encounter, which could be a sidewalk or a park or a bus? All of a sudden, these questions that didn't seem like Christian questions became very pressing. And coming to Calvary had a lot to do for us, which we weren't really up for at Christmas, last Christmas. Calvary's place in the city of Memphis had everything to do why this possibility opened up. The fact that Calvary is conspicuously and carefully looking around its block. Sometimes Margaret Craddock was walking people around this block, I think, and pointing at things and saying, what does this mean? What does this mean for us? What does that boarded up building mean to us? What does that person sleeping over there mean to us? What does looking up and out into the world outside my head and outside the doors of Calvary? I'm going to stop talking, but I am going to read one more poem. Because this is my favorite image of this. It's by Mary Carr, who is a Christian, but this isn't one of her religious poems. It's called A Perfect Mess. I read somewhere that if pedestrians didn't break traffic laws to cross Times Square, whenever and by whatever means possible, the whole city would stop. More jaywalking, right? Sorry. It would stop. Cars would back up to Rhode Island, an epic gridlock not even a cat could thread through. It's not law, but the sprawl of our separate wills that keeps us all flowing. Today I loved the unprecedented gall of the piano movers shoving a roped-up baby grand up 9th Avenue before a thunderstorm. They were a grim and hefty pair, cynical as any day laborers. They knew what was coming. The instrument, white lacquered, the sky bulging black as a bad water balloon, and in one pinprick instant, it burst. A downpour like a fire hose. For a few heartbeats, the whole city stalled, paused, a heart thump. Then it all went staccato. And it was my pleasure to witness a not insignificant miracle. In one instant, every black umbrella in Hell's Kitchen opened on cue. Everyone still moving. It was a scene from an unwritten opera, the sails of some vast armada. And 4 old ladies interrupted their own slow progress to accompany the piano movers, each holding what might have once been lace parasols over the grunting men. I passed next to the crowd of pastel ballerinas huddled under the corner awning in line for an open call, stork-limbed, ankles zigzagged with ribbon, a few passing a cigarette around. The city feeds on beauty, starves for it, breeds it. Coming home after midnight to my deserted block with its famously high subway rat count, I heard a tenor exhale pure longing down the brick canyons. The steaming moon opened its mouth to drink from on high. Part of that story out of my head to the world outside my head and the bodies of people near me ended up in a city. And that scene would have been completely foreign to me growing up. And now it is a place I want to be, a place for the chaos and all of the problems that a city has, but still this sense that there's something outside us that's kind of moving us all through. We are kind of this vast armada, including the stranger with the umbrella held out over the guys moving the piano. Finally occurred to me that for all my baggage growing up from Revelation, that the trajectory of the story in Scripture is not back to the garden. It's not back to some pristine place where the problems never happened, right? It's to the city. Revelation, the image in the city, isn't back to that garden of perfection. In the same way, I would say that the Delta, there's a lot more life in the Delta than back at the head of the stream. It's not just dirt. I mean, that altered the way I read Revelation. I'll leave you with this. The angel who talked to me had a measuring rod of gold to measure the city and its gates and walls. The city lies 4 square, its length the same as its width. And he measured the city with his rod, 1,500 miles. Its length and width and height are equal, He also measured its wall, 144 cubits by human measurement, which the angel was using. The wall was built of jasper, while the city is pure gold, clear as glass. The foundations of the wall of the city are adorned with every jewel. The first was jasper, the second sapphire, the third agate, the fourth emerald, the fifth onyx, the sixth cornelian, the seventh chrysolite, the eighth beryl, the ninth topaz, the 10th chrysoprase. Is that how you say that? The 11th jacinth, the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates are 12 pearls. Each of the gates is a single pearl. And the street of the city is pure gold, transparent as glass. I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God is its light, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. Its gates will never be shut by day, and there will be no night there. Sounds kind of like Memphis, but it's definitely not me and Jesus walking in the garden. It's a vibrant city with people from all over stumbling through the streets, even if they are transparent gold. So that's a thumbnail sketch, sort of how I got being from small-town Arkansas kid to Calvary Church in Memphis, and why I think it matters to be here in Memphis while Memphis becomes the next Memphis, tied to what it's been, but also, who knows? Who knows? Different things are happening here, and I'm excited to be part of that. To be part of that as Calvary Church continues to pay attention to what it means to be Christians right here in this place. Okay, this is a forum that I didn't really think I'd talk that long, but I did. Whether or not any of that made sense to you, what questions do you have of me? Even if there are moments that resonated with you, I'm, as you can tell, I'm more interested in stories than anything. Did anyone bring questions? Hey, Mike. Sorry? Well, I was born in Norwalk, Connecticut. But I got to Arkansas by the time I was 2. I realize that doesn't matter to some people. I'm still a Connecticut Yankee. Siloam Springs was the place where I grew up, though. So. Oh, yes. Well, I don't know if it's the first time, but I can tell you the first memorable time. And I was old. Relatively, it's when we moved to Virginia for seminary. Because Northwest Arkansas, if you go to the big city, you go to Tulsa. I'd hardly been to Little Rock except to go see the Capitol when I was a kid, So everything went the other direction. But Ardell and I have vivid memories of driving our enormous yellow Penske van with my pickup truck pulled to the back. I think we were like 60 feet long altogether, across the bridge into Memphis in a big full moon. And, we were 4.5, 5 hours into our journey to Alexandria, Virginia. And that's the first memory I have of Memphis, and it's vivid. It was less than a year after 9/11, by the way, and we drove that Penske van right down onto the Washington Mall, but that's another story. Ardell and I met at John Brown University in college, but we didn't, as she likes to say, I don't think we had a conversation there. We were both in my younger brother's wedding, and I went off doing the carpentry thing, was all the way out in Washington State. I won't tell that whole story, but there was a really weird grapevine thing that went from Pennsylvania to Arkansas, all the way out to Washington State, that gave me the idea that Ardell, who I knew who she was, might be interested in me, and there was no truth to it whatsoever. I mean, it just, and, but she got that way when I got back. So, when I moved back. Anyway. What do you want to tell me, too? You can tell me about what I missed. What I need to know. Oh, talk about my youngest child going to college next week. Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, our daughter Kate will be on the 20th next week. We'll after church, we go get on an airplane to take our youngest, and yeah, it's no big deal. That is, it is part of our story coming here. As far as it's one of the reasons we weren't interested in this job in November. Or Christmas, or because we assumed it was a bad time for Kate, our daughter. And then when we went back and asked her, should we just go talk to this Bill Craddock guy, just have coffee with him about Memphis? And she's like, sure, yeah, we can move to Memphis, that'd be cool. Fix up another house, that'd be great. So Kate's kind of ready to move on to a new chapter. If she hadn't have been, she had veto power early on. It would have been really easy to say no. But it's another reason why it's a new day for Ardell and me. We have a new city, a new community, a new rhythm to our own life, which will shape us in different ways as those patterns, as the liturgy of our daily lives changes a little bit or a lot. Fortunately, Kate's been here to help us get the house in order as much as she can. If she had her way, the house would be completely in order right now, but we keep dragging her down. Anything else we should talk about today? I don't know if this was what was supposed to happen here. Just told a rector's forum was supposed to happen, which is, yeah. Yeah. Question was about, we came from Little Rock, from another downtown church, urban church context, which was part of what ended up reinforcing this unexpected change to being interested in cities and churches in cities. Christ Church has a lot in common. It's why I accidentally last week invited everyone to Christ Church at the announcements. Still deprogramming. Christ Church is also the oldest church in the diocese, and it's the downtown church, but who didn't really want the bishop around at some point, said, let's just put the cathedral over there. Little Rock and Memphis, even Little Rock's a smaller city, also had suffered many of the struggles that almost all cities in the second half of the 20th century suffered as the center hollowed out, and the people who could get out got out. And actually in Little Rock, they constructed maybe the shortest interstate in the world, 6 miles, I-630, to make sure there was a nice, efficient way for the people to get out. It just happened to erase a vibrant black business and arts district, including an African-American Episcopal church. But some people's needs, we don't always see the world from the perspective of people who are unlike us, and the people who are powered did not. So that was Little Rock's story, and Little Rock has been turning and trying to come back from that. Memphis has a similar, you all stopped the interstate, I'll say that. Kudos to Memphis. You had your own Jane Jacobs, if you know that name, from New York. So both of the cities, southern cities, had a lot of the struggles over the second half of the 20th century, and downtown became a place that a lot of people were just scared of. And both churches stayed. And both cities started to turn corners. It was really just in the last couple of years that Main Street started to take hold in Little Rock, which is just a couple of blocks. It was just a block from Christ Church. And it was exciting to see what was happening a block over, and what did that mean for the church? Well, how could we open our doors to new life? All of a sudden, people were living downtown increasingly, and then eventually there were different kinds of people. There were more kind of price points in where they might live, and a lot of struggle. And I can see it happening here. There are these pockets where all of a sudden something's taken hold, and there's a community there. There are people on the sidewalks and walking and working and living in different places. Those are commonalities. I think we got some work to do here I mean, in our immediate context, right? We have some struggles, and I think there's some places where Memphis is a bigger place. At the same time, I'm astounded, just in the few weeks I've been here, especially at the community of givers in Memphis. I heard this. Don't correct me if I'm wrong. Even if I'm wrong, don't correct me. I heard only Salt Lake City has a higher philanthropic rate than Memphis. Is that right? Mike, is that right? Only Salt Lake City. And I can see it when I start to look around here and see this incredible things that are happening by people who are giving to make Memphis a better place. That happens in Little Rock, but I'd say one difference is I didn't see it at that level. The things that people come together and put together for the sake of the city are astonishing, as with new eyes coming in and looking at it. The Crosstown thing is mind-boggling. Bridges, it's amazing. So as big a challenge as that 100 North Main seems right now, if it can be undone, if it can be turned around, this is the place that it can happen. It's amazing. So thanks, Martin. It's cool to be in a place where some of that will translate, I think. Any other pressing questions? It's 11:15. I think that's. I don't know if what's that? I mean 12:15. Yeah. Thank you all for welcoming us here. We're excited to be here. God bless you all. Oh, and don't forget, now anyone who'd like to can go to the open house and see what's going on in the young people's classes, see their teachers and whatnot. So go check it out.